I want to come back and go more high level
Hmm.
and talk about diet to support our brain.
There are three levers that I like to talk about. Everybody likes to have their levers or pillars or whatever. So I have three. And so the first is basically maximize the nutrient density of your diet. If you think about the process of generating and sending a signal in the brain, which is happening in billions of neurons constantly in your life, if you think about the coordination and the nutrients required to do that, it's essentially like it's mind-boggling. You just can't even understand how it's even happening. But it's everything from iron, vitamin D, omega-3s, all those B vitamins that we talked about, magnesium and zinc, because they're neuromodulators that get released with neurotransmitters, choline to make acetylcholine, like all the amino acids that are the precursors to things like serotonin and dopamine. All of these things we need to get from our diet. So the best likelihood of us achieving that is having a diet that's as nutrient dense as possible. And in general, that is a diet that has high quality, minimally processed animal and plant foods, like antioxidants, lutein, zeaxanthin, anthocyanins, and other polyphenols from berries, and coffee and tea. These all have been found to be beneficial for long-term brain health in various different ways. So a diet that looks like a whole foods based and minimally processed diet is the one that's the most nutrient dense. If you don't have a diet that is as nutrient dense as you want it to be, then I think we're seeing more and more evidence that people, a multivitamin can help. So the Cosmos trial recently showed that. And then they also had an arm of the Cosmos trial that included cocoa flavonols as an antioxidant. And that was beneficial in people who had low antioxidant intake in their diet in general. It wasn't beneficial for everybody, but like if you're not eating berries and fruits and vegetables and things that have these sort of like colorful type antioxidants, then it seems that like a flavonoid supplement could be beneficial as well. So the nutrients is the thing that I like to focus on the most, because if you get the nutrients, it doesn't really matter where the nutrients come from, right? Then we don't have to argue about keto versus plant-based versus paleo versus carnivore. Like, just get the nutrients that you need, and that's it. As long as, which is the next lever, you consume enough total food. So for most people, overeating and entering into energy excess, insulin resistance, that's most common in modern societies. So what's good about sort of like a whole food type diet is that it's much harder to overeat it and end up in energy excess. And what's interesting is that you can see, like, looking across societies across the world, including the US and Europe, but also hunter-gatherer type groups, what you see is this inverted U-shaped curve of energy intake and brain, like how much brain you have. And brain volume is a critical predictor of long-term brain function and brain health. So at low energy intakes, so either think, people who, tribes where they just don't have, hunter-gatherers who don't have access to much food, or you're a subsistence farmer and the crop fails, or you're some like calorie restriction obsessed longevity person, you're at low energy availability. That's associated with lower brain volume, because if you don't have the energy to support that brain, you're not going to maintain that brain structure or build it in the first place. Then brain volume increases as energy availability increases. So in that scenario, the more you eat, the better. More calories is better. You've got more energy to support a bigger brain. Eventually, at some point, you enter this tipping point of energy excess, and that's where we start to see. That's why obesity is associated with long-term cognitive decline. It's why prediabetes and type 2 diabetes are associated with faster cognitive decline and more dementia. Metabolic syndrome, anything in that picture, then brain volume starts to decrease again. So that is like the next lever, is you need enough energy, but not too much. And then the reason why I talk about like nutrients and then energy is then like how you achieve that is through like your overall dietary pattern, right? And so like the pattern answer I already gave you, which is, ideally a minimally processed whole foods based diet. But if you're an athlete who has very high energy requirements, maybe that includes a ton of processed food just so you can get enough calories in, right? I've seen that a bunch as well. So then their pattern has to be different because they have different energy requirements. So the way I think about it is you take your nutrient needs and you take your energy needs, and then you use that to figure out a dietary pattern that best provides both of those. And as long as you do that, where that energy comes from and where those nutrients come from, I'm completely agnostic to it.
The part I really want to hone in on is this uniqueness of the brain, at least the way I understand it, where it can burn glucose, it can burn ketones, but fatty acids, not so much. And this ties into the whole metabolic health piece, and I want to go deeper into that with you, where if somebody is metabolically unhealthy, which is most people these days, unfortunately, they might run into some problems with brain energy. So to start, can the brain burn any fatty acids, or is it just limited?
So it can burn some fatty acids, but only ones, and this is something that there was actually a very recent paper that kind of expanded our understanding of this. Do you see the paper on like white matter shrinks in marathon runners?
No, I didn't.
So
I want to hear about it though.
Yeah, so they took 10 marathon runners in Spain, and they scanned their brains before and afterwards. And what they saw was that the white matter, which is where the myelin, all the most of the fat in your brain, and your brain is mostly like the non-water content of your brain is majority fat, and most of that is in myelin, which wraps around and protects neurons in the white matter. So it allows for fast connection through the brain and to the body. And what's unique about human brains is they have more white matter than any other species. So like a rodent is 5 to 10%, a human is more than 60% white matter. And what they saw was that from like before and after the marathon, the white matter shrank in these marathon runners, but it was reversible. So like 3 months later, they'd restored it. But the idea is that in a significant energetic stress, which a marathon is, right, you cannot consume the number of calories that you need to do a marathon during a marathon. So because the brain isn't getting as much energy as it needs, it will start to eat itself, and it will use fatty acids within the brain to help support it. And then that recovers just fine. And like, it's not a problem. There's no reason to think it's bad, but it's just that was evidence of the brain using its own fatty acids for energy. But the brain does not take up fatty acids from the blood for energy necessarily. Most fatty acids and cholesterol in the brain are synthesized locally and from glucose or ketones. So particularly during brain development, all the fat, or the majority of the fat and cholesterol that accumulates in the brain when it's first growing, are synthesized from glucose and ketones. And actually ketones are preferentially used as a synthetic precursor in the developing brain. That's why breast milk contains medium chain triglycerides, which the baby turns into ketones. Ketones go into the brain. Brain uses the ketones to build things, including fat, cholesterol. So in general, the answer is no. The brain doesn't take up fatty acids from the blood specifically to burn them for energy, but does take up glucose or ketones or lactate if lactate is available from exercise. And so you're right that as your people become metabolically unhealthy, or they become insulin resistant, there does seem to be this link then to cognitive decline and dementia. So I already kind of mentioned that there are studies that look at cognitive decline over time. And in people who have normal blood sugar control, so they have an HbA1c below 5.7, which is what they used in this study, then they looked at people with prediabetes, so above 5.7 up to 6.5, so prediabetes, so they have higher blood sugar. They had faster cognitive decline, and then it was even faster in people who had type 2 diabetes, so even worse insulin resistance and blood sugar control. And then there's also evidence, or like one of the ways that you help to diagnose Alzheimer's disease in particular, is that glucose uptake into the brain declines over time. So you can kind of you can measure glucose uptake into the brain using something called a PET scan, and you can see, oh yeah, there's not as much glucose going into the brain here. Some of it seems to be related. So if you have metabolic disease, it's maybe impairing glucose uptake into the brain. But the other side of that is also that, particularly in the early stages of cognitive decline, the brain will take up more glucose, but it has to ask for it. So some of it is demand driven. Like, we're not using our brains, so our brain then isn't asking for glucose. So it's not necessarily that the glucose can't get in. It's that the brain isn't asking for it. And there are studies that show that if you stimulate the brain with a cognitively challenging task, it will, like, even in early Alzheimer's disease, that glucose will get in. It just, the brain needs to ask for it. So this is why when I said earlier that demand is what, like, stimulus is what's really critical, that stimulus is what drives some glucose uptake into the brain. But yes, in general, one of the biggest risk factors for dementia in the modern world is some kind of state of energy excess or insulin resistance. And it probably, the downstream effect is either through impaired glucose uptake, high levels of inflammation, high levels of oxidative stress. It's then impairing energy production in the brain, which then creates or helps to precipitate cognitive decline.
In a classic sense, insulin resistance is when somebody is consuming more carbs or sugar, spiking blood glucose, and then insulin comes in to drive that into cells. And over time, the body becomes resistant to that insulin, and that system isn't working well. A, is that how you see insulin resistance? And then B, let's take it to the brain, because we do have the blood-brain barrier there. And you've touched on this, but I want to make sure I understand this piece, because so many people are affected by this. And I could see how it could affect things like just cognition day to day, dementia, mental health challenges, when energy isn't getting to the brain like it should be.
This traditional idea that eating lots of carbs, that spikes lots of insulin, and then that causes insulin resistance, in of itself, I don't think that that's actually what's happening. Because there are plenty of people who eat lots of refined carbohydrates, they spike their insulin all the time, blood sugar comes down, they're fine, they never develop insulin resistance. It's much more to do with the chronic overconsumption of calories that then messes with your insulin signaling system. So as you accumulate excess energy on your body, initially as subcutaneous fat and then as visceral fat or fat, fat around your organs or fat in your organs, like fat in your pancreas or in your liver, what happens is those cells those cells then don't listen to the signal of insulin because there's already too much energy in them. So insulin's main job is not to shove glucose into cells. Actually, you need a little bit for that to happen. And the reason why we think that that's insulin's main job is because of type 1 diabetes, where if you don't have any insulin, no glucose gets into cells and you get in trouble very quickly. But most of us just have like a small amount of insulin and it goes around the body and it opens the gates and glucose gets in just fine. Like, most of the glucose uptake in our body is demand driven, like I mentioned, in the brain, but also in muscles. So most of the majority of the glucose in your body is taken up by your muscles, and the majority of that is based on the activity of the muscles. So if those muscles aren't moving, they don't ask for the glucose. It's not that the glucose can't get in. In fact, particularly in early prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, there's lots of glucose going into those cells, but it's not being used, and that's the problem. Is that the energy is not being used on the back end. So it's actually this overaccumulation of energy substrates, either in the fat tissue or in other tissues, that are not being used, that then impair insulin signaling, and they sort of shut down insulin signaling by saying we can't take any more. And the next step that's the problem here is that what insulin's main job is actually to shut down the release of energy into the system from muscle tissue and fat tissue. So it inhibits proteolysis, which is the breakdown of muscle tissue to release amino acids, and it inhibits lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat tissue to release fatty acids into the body for energy. So when you become insulin resistant, because those tissues already have so much energy in them, what happens is they start to spill out. So you have a very high turnover in the fat tissue that essentially dumps a bunch of fatty acids into the system, because insulin can't do its job. It can't hold it in like it's supposed to do. And then when you have too many fatty acids in the system, that's when you then start to see liver impairment and all these other issues. So insulin's main job is to regulate how much energy is circulating in the system. And when tissues become insulin resistant because they have too much energy inside them, you then get too much energy as glucose and fatty acids circulating in the body, which then causes those downstream issues. So it's a slightly more nuanced picture of what insulin does, but its main job at the normal levels that get released after we eat is to stop the breakdown of tissues, stop fat being released from fat tissue, stop glycogen being used, stop muscle tissue being broken down. Because then when we're not eating and we need that energy, insulin drops, they get released into the system and the liver turns those things into glucose to be used. So that's its main job. And when those systems already have too much energy in them, insulin can't do its job, and we end up with this sort of energy toxicity, too much circulating around the body. Sorry, that was a really long answer to your question, but that's kind of I think about insulin a lot, or at least I have done over the years.
Let's bring it back to the brain, and you've touched on this, but I want to make sure I have full clarity here. Let's talk about, as somebody's becoming metabolically unhealthy, all the different components here in the brain. And we've already talked about the fact that fatty acids can't get in there well. And you've just clarified some nuance there when it comes to insulin resistance. But basically, why I want to go here and make sure we have full clarity is so many people are affected by this. And I want them to understand, if they're in this boat, how it could be affecting their cognition day to day, and then potentially lead to things like mental health challenges and dementia.
Yeah, you mentioned the blood-brain barrier earlier. And one role of the blood-brain barrier is to make sure that our brain is protected from all the other stuff that's circulating around in our blood. There are a few parts of the brain where there's less of a strict barrier, but for most of the brain, it's very highly regulated, including energy getting into the brain. And when you start to enter this sort of state of energy toxicity, as you could call it, you start to see, first of all, an increase. One thing that we know that happens is an increase in inflammation, an increase in oxidative stress, because the system can't handle all the energy that's circulating. And both of those are very closely tied to issues with, say, depression and anxiety. Right, inflammation seems to be a driver in some significant proportion of people with depression. It's not everybody, but it seems to be a significant contributor to a good chunk. I think some people have said like a third of depression seems to be sort of inflammatory driven, and oxidative stress similarly. So these things impair the function of the mitochondria, but also impair the function of the regulating or sort of resident immune cells in the brain, like the microglia. If anybody have heard of those, the microglia are essentially our brain's version of an immune system, and chronic inflammation, oxidative stress can make them angry. And the microglia are the most complex cell in the body by far. There's like thousands of different versions of them and different jobs that we still don't fully understand. So I'm painting very broad strokes here, but in general, they're really important for monitoring synapses, helping repair injury, some parts of signaling. And in this setting of chronic inflammation, they can then start to essentially accelerate that. You make a microglia angry, it increases inflammatory processes. It can increase the breakdown or issues in communications with neurons. So that's probably a big part of it. And that, like you say, when we're thinking about contributors to dementia and cognitive decline, inflammation and energy signaling and the way that it interacts with both like the function of neurons, but also cells like the microglia, seems to be a significant proportion of what's contributing to cognitive decline. It's not necessarily just through energy availability. It's also through like what are the downstream effects, like inflammatory processes that then have a knock-on effect on multiple parts of the brain. So there's another bit that we haven't really talked about, which is very relevant to this scenario, which is the health of the blood vessels. So as we have chronically elevated blood glucose or blood pressure, or anything else that contributes to poor cardiovascular health, one of the things that people don't necessarily appreciate about the brain is that it's essentially this really, really dense network of blood vessels with a few neurons thrown in. Like if you took away all the other cells in the brain, you would see this really dense sort of structure of blood vessels that the kind of like all the cells are kind of impregnated into. So really the brain is this massive vascular network, and then that kind of runs the whole system. And so when a certain part of the brain becomes active, it asks for more energy. There's this thing called neurovascular coupling. And then that part of the brain delivers more blood flow. It starts to divert blood flow to that area. If you don't have healthy blood vessels, that can't happen. And we know that endothelial function and blood vessel function declines as we become less metabolically flexible or less metabolically healthy over time. So yes, there's effects on energy availability, there's effects on inflammation, how that affects the cells in the brain. And then there's also, are you impacting just the ability to get oxygen and nutrients to those parts of the brain because of a healthy vascular system or not? And that's where like metabolic health, we know, is very tightly linked to cardiovascular health. So that's a big part of it too. And when you look at something like Alzheimer's disease, most people who have Alzheimer's disease also have vascular disease in the brain. Like they're not, for most people, it's not separate entities. Like it's the same, it's part of the same disease process. We, as neurologists and neuroscientists, we like to classify things into these nice little buckets. But actually, particularly vascular dementia and Alzheimer's disease overlap very tightly. And I think for most people, they're probably part of the same process. And some of that is deteriorating function of the blood vessels, which we know is very tightly linked to metabolic health.
Let's bring ketones in now in the ketogenic diet, because a lot of what we've been talking about now can be helped or remedied with that diet. The energy getting into the brain, we have ketones now. The metabolic dysfunction and the effects on the vessels, the inflammation. So to me, why I'm such an advocate for discussing and sharing this diet and actually consuming it myself is because of all these different reasons. And for the general population, people that are metabolically unhealthy, which again is 90+%, this can be such a powerful tool, at least in the intermediate, to regain metabolic health. So share your thoughts on that.
I've been a big supporter of low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets for a long time in certain scenarios, and certainly we have a lot of people in the psychiatry space who are showing that ketogenic diets can be helpful with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, depression. You have guys like Stephen Kinane showing that MCT oil could help improve certain aspects of brain energetics in cognitive decline and maybe early Alzheimer's disease. And some of that does seem to be that ketones are more readily crossing the brain and providing an energetic substrate to the brain. Some other parts of it could be because, like I already mentioned, that ketones are a preferred synthetic substrate. So if your brain is trying to repair itself from something, actually those ketones might provide the building blocks in order to do that. That's one reason why I think ketones could be beneficial after traumatic brain injury or concussion. There isn't a ton of evidence for that yet, except for in animal models. There isn't great evidence in humans yet, but I think like theoretically it makes sense. So there are scenarios where ketones do seem to be able to rescue some aspects of cognitive function or mental health. It does require, I think, a bigger picture though, because one of the reasons why any restrictive diet, and here you're restricting carbohydrate, is like you decrease the amount of energy, the total energy in your system, right? So any diet that sustainably allows you to decrease calorie intake, I think is going to have a lot of these same benefits, because a lot of it's stemming from essentially energy toxicity. So there are other studies where people go on a whole food plant-based diet in, with early cognitive decline, and they see benefit. And I think across both groups, what you're seeing is you just eat, you're already energy overloaded, and you're offsetting that and starting to come back from that because of the changed dietary pattern. So yes, ketones have a special role, but for most people, the issue is energy overload and energy toxicity. And the easiest way to do that is whatever diet allows you to enter into a calorie deficit. So I'm definitely a proponent of ketogenic diets when used in the right setting, but I don't think that they're like the prescription that everybody needs, because I think the main issue is energy toxicity. And so I'll give you another example. There was a recent very large randomized controlled trial published in the New England Journal of Medicine, like the world's top medical journal, or one of the world's top medical journals, where they compared a Mediterranean style diet, the MIND diet, which is a sort of a nutrient dense Mediterranean style diet specifically focused on brain health. It's like a combination of the DASH diet and the Mediterranean diet. They compared that to just standard calorie restriction. Both groups saw significant improvements in cognitive function, and both groups lost the same amount of weight and improved their body composition in the same amount. So even though one diet, I would have put all my money on the MIND diet, more nutrients, less processed, all that kind of stuff. But in that setting, the most important thing was decreasing energy intake, that's the scenario that most of us are in. So yeah, I am really excited about work on ketogenic diets in psychiatric disorders. I'm really excited about ketogenic diets and the research in concussion, traumatic brain injury. But for most of us, the diet that's gonna work is the one where we can sustainably decrease calorie intake, because like that's where the biggest stress is coming from the brain. And yes, ketones might help offset some of that in some populations, but I think the main problem is just our total energy intake.
What's your current diet like? And do you ever dip into ketosis to provide that alternative energy for your brain?
So I have been low carb and keto, tried carnivore. I've tried paleo for a while. I was plant-based for a while. I've tried them all just to kind of like see the effects. Essentially, I kind of eat what I said, which is a minimally processed, whole foods, nutrient dense type diet. So I eat meat, I eat a lot of veggies. I don't eat a ton of starchy carbohydrates like rice, bread, cakes, cookies. I don't eat a ton of desserts. It's mainly like meat and veggies and fruit. Yeah, and like certainly some grains. I'll cook pasta occasionally, cook rice occasionally. Sometimes I'll make a pizza. Like I'm not strict. I'm not like strictly restricting carbohydrates. But I work with very good friends who are military vets who had several concussions, and they're like, my brain only works when I'm in ketosis. So I've certainly seen that work for some people. But my main focus is, am I getting enough energy to fuel my workouts? And am I getting all the nutrients that I think my brain needs? And the way I do that is just minimally processed sort of whole foods. But I don't like particularly, I restrict kind of really energy dense carbohydrates from like a processed food standpoint, but I don't restrict carbohydrates in general, if that makes sense.
You mentioned Stephen Cunane and MCT oil. For yourself and others, how do you look at things like C8, C10 MCT oil and exogenous ketones to provide that keto source of energy for the brain?
Again, so I advise a couple of companies that make these things from like a scientific standpoint. I mean, I don't make any money from it because I'm excited about their potential applications. The problem that I've really seen in this arena is that there's so much hype and very little really good quality science. So there are some groups like Jonathan Little's group up at UBC. They've done studies of ketone esters in type 2 diabetes and obesity. In like some of their studies, it seems to improve cognitive function, and some of their studies it doesn't. Like I said, in like specific clinical scenarios, they're just the Stephen Cunneen's studies with MCT oil in people with early cognitive decline. But again, there's just so much where people are saying this is the answer, but those studies still haven't been done yet. So it's not something that I widely recommend, because I can't say in this scenario I think this is going to be beneficial from you because that study hasn't been done. So that I know there are lots of people who anecdotally feel a lot better, when they take MCT oil, they put it in their coffee, or they take ketone esters. There are certainly some potential like performance applications, and again, just now some of the best quality studies are being done, like by my friend Andrew Kutnik, who's at the Sansom Institute. They've published some studies on ketone esters in like hypoxia and exercise in military scenarios. And again, like sometimes there's a benefit, but sometimes there isn't. So when people are actually doing high quality studies, it's a little mixed. Like sometimes you kind of say, oh yeah, this is doing what we think it's doing, and sometimes it's not. So like I said, I'm a believer that we will find the right scenarios where these things will be beneficial. But I'm still waiting for the research for me to be able to just say, oh yeah, we need to put ketone esters in the water supply or something, which other people, I think at one point, Richard Veach, who was the inventor of like the original ketone ester that most studies still use and groups still use. I think at one point he said we should just like put it in the water supply. I'm still waiting for the study that convinces me that that's the case. So I'm a fan of these things. I don't think the research is there yet in the way that I would want to see it.
Last question for you. Fasting. Shorter and longer term fasts. Connect those to brain health.
The main way that I think those are going to improve brain health, again, is through like manipulation of overall energy availability. When you look, so most of what we've been sold on the effects of, let's say, like intermittent fasting on health has been done in mouse studies. And in mice, intermittent fasting, like not eating for several hours in a day, in mice, that's a big problem. Like a mouse doesn't eat for 24 hours, it dies, right? Fasting in mice is a huge energetic stress. And that's what drives a lot of these adaptations. Fasting in humans is not a huge energetic stress. You could survive several days without eating. Like you wouldn't enjoy it necessarily unless you've kind of gotten used to prolonged fasting. But it's not driving these same adaptations in humans that it's driving in mice, because it's not nearly the energetic stress that it is in mice. So an example of this, again, another colleague of mine, Christy Storashuk, she recently published a systematic review and meta-analysis looking at the effects of fasting on muscle tissue and mitochondrial function, like the signatures of mitochondrial biogenesis. People have talked about PGC1 alpha, and this stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis, and we stimulate that when we fast. And there are reviews in very fancy journals that say that this is the case. When she looked at all the literature, that effect in rodents, it did happen in some studies, but not in others, and it does not happen in humans at all, because fasting just isn't that kind of stress to the muscles of humans. So I think that some of these benefits of fasting are possible at very extended fasts, but in order to do that, it has to become a significant energetic stress, like it is in mice. So we're talking several days, really prolonged fasts. If you're thinking about some of the downstream effects of fasting, so like autophagy is the one that we hear about a lot, right? You're turning over junky proteins and cells. And the fastest way to stimulate autophagy in humans is exercise. and aerobic exercise. So you can fast for like 24 hours. You won't see any autophagy in many cells in the body. As soon as you start exercising, you're going to start stimulating autophagy. And we do have to extrapolate something from mouse studies, because I can't measure autophagy in your brain after you do a workout. But when you stimulate autophagy in other animals through exercise, you stimulate autophagy throughout the body. So I think that fasting is a great tool if it allows, if you need to decrease your current energy load, your calorie load, and fasting allows you to do that. That's great. Like, if manipulating your diet or going keto is not for you, but you can just not eat for a day and that works for you, great. But it's mainly working by decreasing overall energy load. And then if you want to upregulate some of these longevity processes that are supposedly associated with fasting, the easiest way to do that is go for a jog. So that's what I would do. Whatever dietary pattern allows you to, best control energy intake so that you don't enter into, or you start to reverse some of the effects of energy excess, insulin resistance, metabolic disease. And then to actually stimulate the processes that we think about with fasting, do some exercise. And there's a nice quote from Bill Lagarkos, which is that exercise is fasting and fast forward. And essentially that's kind of how I see it too.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
This traditional idea that eating lots of carbs, that spikes lots of insulin, and then that causes insulin resistance, in and of itself, I don't think that that's actually what's happening. As people become metabolically unhealthy, or they become insulin resistant, there does seem to be this